On 8th of March, the Ukrainian President Zelensky has addressed to the UK Parliament via video link, and he quoted Winston Churchill. He quoted Winston Churchill that we will fight to the end at sea, in the air. We will continue fighting for our land, whatever the cost. We will fight in the forests, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets. He further said, we will not give up and we will not lose. Professor, after this statement, we assume that this war will not end soon. And in case Russia takes over the control of Ukraine and change the regime, and after that Ukrainian people, they start guerrilla war against Russia and so-called regime in Ukraine. Guerrilla war like in Afghanistan against Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani governments and NATO forces, and guerrilla war in Iraq as well. Yeah. So if they start guerrilla war, so do you think in this case Ukraine will be another Afghanistan between Russia and Europe for decades? What is your analysis, please?
Well, I think there is a very real prospect of a long and protracted and very ugly insurgency in Ukraine in the coming decades. Decades, I'll come back to that, maybe not as long as that, but certainly this could go on a long time, and I think there's a very real prospect of it descending into the sort of guerrilla warfare that you've described. Because the Ukrainians have shown that they're very resistant to what's happening. The Churchillian words that Zelensky quoted in Parliament were designed to show that they're going to fight to the last drop of blood, and they're going to not just roll over and accept this situation. We're already supplying arms into the situation, as you know. Several NATO countries are supplying arms and anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainian army. That will almost certainly continue if Russia manages to take over the government of Ukraine. I think there will be a resistance force in Ukraine that will be fighting them on the ground. All of this is obviously horrendous to contemplate because the human cost of it will be terrible. But I think it's a very real prospect, and this will drag on for a long time. I don't think NATO and Europe would be able to accept a Russian-dominated puppet government in Kiev, and would actively want to assist in resistance against it. So an Afghanistan type situation is I think quite a likely scenario. For Russia, then they'd have to count the costs. I think a very pertinent example is Afghanistan in the 1980s, for example, when the Soviet Union invaded, and the West, again, rather than take on the Soviet army in a big battlefield conflict on Afghan soil, as you will remember, we chose to arm and mobilise the militants fighting against them on the ground. And it was messy, it was long, it took a whole decade of conflict, a lot of death and destruction in Afghanistan, but it was ultimately successful. And it was primarily successful because the cost to the Soviet army became so great, not just in terms of the loss of life, but the economic cost of that conflict became so enormous, it arguably triggered the end of the Soviet Union, which came just 2 years after the Soviet army withdrew from Afghanistan. So I think a lot of military strategists will be thinking the same way. They'd be thinking, if we could fuel a counterinsurgency inside Ukraine should Russia take over the country. We could bleed Russia dry effectively and make it so costly for them in the long term that they would have to withdraw. These are terrible things that we're proposing and talking about in a way, because the human cost of all that would be horrendous. But I think it's a very real prospect for the next few years.
For the next few areas?
Yes. How long it would go on, I think years rather than decades, hopefully as short as possible, really. Because the Russian economy won't be able to stand the cost of this for too long. I think there's also interesting developments inside Russian society. We're already seeing some evidence of public opposition to the military campaign. It's difficult to tell because Russia is so restrictive on communications and public expressions of protests, but we do know that significant proportions of the Russian population are not at all supportive of this situation. And if it becomes very costly, if the casualties start to mount, if the Russian army finds itself embroiled in a very bloody and ugly conflict, I think opposition from within Russia might mount fairly quickly to bring this to an end.
Yeah. Do you see any role of China in this war? Because yesterday the United States State Department, they warned China that they should avoid to jump in this conflict. So how do you see the China's role in this war, especially as a Russian ally?
Yes, well, the position of China in all of this is hugely significant, I would say. And it's very interesting to see where they're going to go with this. And they've kind of got divided loyalties to a certain extent. And on the one hand, we know that they've increasingly in recent years become a close ally of Russia. They see themselves and Russia as very much aligned in developing a new world order, effectively, a new way of looking at the world, a new anti-Western, anti-liberal way of looking at the world. To a certain extent, they probably have foreseen a shared future where they join together and become a significant force in opposition to the Western liberal world. But I think at the same time, the Chinese will also be very worried about backing the wrong horse in this conflict. And as we know, there are a couple of key things that China really cares about. One is the principle of non-interference in other sovereign states, and they have expressed this in the last day or so, that their starting position is that states shouldn't invade other sovereign states. Yeah. So obviously that places their full support of Russia on a slightly difficult footing, because Russia has clearly transgressed that principle. They wouldn't want to set any precedents that cause complications for themselves in the future. And of course the economic implications of this are hugely significant for China, because one of the things they really want is to be a very successful and a very profitable economy, and to be able to expand their industry and sell across the world. They won't be particularly happy about the consequences to the global economy at the moment, which are going to affect every country, including China, significantly for the coming years. They also won't necessarily want to get backed into a corner whereby they and Russia are a slightly isolated and cut off part of the global economy that isn't able to easily trade with the rest of the world. They won't want that, because it will ultimately be very damaging for China itself. So I think, and we're seeing in the slightly circumspect way that China has responded in the last few weeks, that they're not throwing all of their support behind Russia. They're trying to keep their powder dry, as we say, and to think carefully what their moves are going to be. I think there's also an opportunity for China, as there is for some other countries, such as Turkey, for example, to be seen to be a a mediator in this crisis, be seen to bring the parties to the table and find a diplomatic solution. That's always a nice way for any state to be seen and to consider itself. So I think they may play a very, very significant role in how this situation plays out and how it's brought to an end.
Yeah. According to the United Nations, so far more than 2.5 million refugees have left Ukraine for European countries, and especially Poland. Do you think that Europe is able to deal and ready to deal with this flow of migrants, please?
Yes, it's a very significant move of people. We don't know the exact figures, but clearly, more than 1.5 million, if not more, have moved already, and many more will move if the situation gets worse. Europe, if anywhere, is able to deal with that movement of people. Europe is probably better placed than lots of other parts of the world to be able to deal with it. But they'll have to have a strategy, and the European Union has struggled to have a coherent strategy on migration in the past. We've seen that with the large amounts of migration across the Mediterranean into the southern European states, there's been a lot of problems within the European Union in terms of having a shared and equitable plan of action. And there's a lot of evidence that southern European states like Greece, Italy and Spain have borne a disproportionate burden from these movements. So what the EU won't want to do is to make the same mistakes and allow Poland and Romania and Moldova and countries like that to have to just suck this up, because Poland particularly has huge numbers of migrants are now in Poland, and they're having to bear the cost of sorting that situation out. But I think they will be able to do it. I think Europe will be able to absorb this number of people if they have a good plan and a good strategy, and if they enable the problem to be spread as far as possible and shared across countries, and the UK as well. I mean, UK is not in the EU anymore, of course, but I think we can and we absolutely should have a role to play in playing our part in helping to alleviate this situation.
Yeah, and the United States and European Union and the United Kingdom, they imposed very strict sanctions on Russia. Are these sanctions effective as a weapon against Russia?
Well, it's another very good question. I mean, sanctions are traditionally a rather imprecise instrument to use. They often don't have the effect that one hopes they will have. Sometimes they can even backfire. We've seen in situations in Iran, for example, and one or two other places where, far from allowing the West to impose its will and achieve the outcomes that it wants, it actually turns populations against the West even more than they were before, because if the local government is clever enough, it can say the economic misery you're facing is not our fault, it's the fault of the Western nations who are strangling our economy. However, I think in the case of Russia, I think these sanctions will have an effect. How quickly they will have an effect is another question. But and we should remember that the degree to which sanctions are being applied against the Russian economy is really quite comprehensive at the moment. And it's almost every day there's a new measure put in place by Western countries in particular. These things will hurt the Russian economy a lot. And as we were saying earlier, if significant proportions of the Russian people can see that this is not because they're being victimised by the West, it's because of the situation that President Putin has led them into, then there will be increasing pressure on Putin to withdraw and to step back. it's very sad for the Russian people, because I think the economic consequences of this are going to be huge, and in some ways Putin has accelerated the things he didn't want to happen. So, for example, Western, and particularly Western European, dependence on Russian oil and gas. Oil and gas is such a significant part of the Russian economy. That's now going to change much more rapidly than might have been the case
So
before.
you see any energy crisis here in Europe? Yeah,
Potentially.
especially inflation, Russian
Yes.
energy crisis.
Yes, that is an immediate concern for sure. And again, it affects different parts of Europe differently. So, UK, for example, imports relatively little Russian oil and gas, and would be able to bear the disruptions to supply. Other countries like Germany and
the biggest
neighbouring
buyer,
countries, if things moved badly and quickly, if the prices started to really accelerate, and that could lead to a very significant crisis, I think. So, but the one thing Europe now knows, if it didn't know before, is that it really has to reduce its dependence on Russian oil and gas.
Professor, what do you think are the likely outcome of this Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, that's a very good and very difficult question, Mohammed, of course, because predicting these situations is extraordinarily difficult, and predicting that this was going to happen, a lot of people got this wrong. Now predicting what the outcomes are going to be is difficult. I think there are several different scenarios here potentially, and for me probably the likeliest situation is what we were describing earlier. I think there is likely to be a long drawn out, low to medium level conflict that develops into a sort of insurgency against the occupying Russian forces. I think Russia will struggle to gain complete control over the country. That will go on for quite a long time, regretfully, will trigger lots of movements of people and humanitarian crises, and will be very ugly. But I think that's, at the moment, that looks like the likeliest situation. The other scenarios are either that it gets a lot worse and moves into a much bigger full-scale conflict, particularly if NATO get involved. I think that's relatively unlikely at the moment, because NATO is still being very resolute about its reluctance to get heavily involved in this conflict, for good reasons, as we've described earlier. Of course that could change, particularly if Russia did something crazy like lob some missiles into Poland or something of that nature. I think the other possible scenarios, and in some ways they would be good scenarios, is if something happens inside Russia itself that brings an end to this conflict. And I think there are three ways that might happen. One is that Putin may realise that this isn't going the way that he wants it to go, that the Russian economy is going to collapse, and agrees to some sort of diplomatic climb down, some sort of situation in which he can withdraw at least partially and retain some degree of honour. It's possible, it's lots of people will be working hard to bring about a diplomatic solution. I think if the Russian people, there could be an uprising in the Russian population if it gets really bad and really costly. I think that's relatively unlikely, because it's so difficult in Russia for people to rise up, and the costs of doing that are very high. We've seen that even calling the situation a war can now land you in prison for 15 years in Russia. So it's very difficult for opposition to rise up. I think the other scenario is if the military command, if the generals in the Russian army decide to bring about some sort of coup or put pressure on Putin to bring this to an end. Again, if it goes very badly for a long time, if they lose significant numbers of troops, we've seen several of a handful of generals have already been killed in the conflict. They may say to Putin, look, we're not going to obey your orders anymore and we have to withdraw. So I think there's several different scenarios. Regretfully, I think the likeliest scenario is that this is going to drag on in a rather ugly way for quite a while, and I wish that wasn't the case, because the cost of that is going to be horrible. But if I had to bet, I think that's the likeliest situation.
Professor, last question. Do you think that a comedian actor and a peacetime President Zelensky proved himself as a wartime leader?
Well, it's in every situation. If we look across history, it's often extraordinary who the characters are that step into the limelight and go down in history as the figures that we remember. And sometimes they're the less likely people in a way. I mean, here in the we spoke about Churchill earlier. Churchill had a rather checkered political career. He wouldn't necessarily have been seen as a great leader before. Indeed, after the war, he was voted out as not a very good prime minister. But in the particular circumstances of the war and the situation we were in here in the UK, he turned out to be the right man and the most inspiring man. And I think, you know, in a weird way, maybe a stand-up comedian has a lot of skill in talking to people and getting their attention. So maybe Zelensky is the right man at this moment to mobilise the Ukrainian resistance to Russian invasion. Certainly he seems to be doing that at the moment. He's inspiring a lot of people. So maybe he's the right man in the right place.
Professor, thank you very much for your time, for your nice and good information, and goodbye, viewers.